In this section, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the control interface that we're using in the game provided. So there are 3 buttons available in this game. There's the left button, the right button, and the restart menu button in this title screen. So all 3 of these buttons have different functionality, and we're going to go through each one and kind of describe what they do and how they do it. So first off, let's take a look at the restart button. The restart button is quite simple. It is added when the title screen is created. So when you create a new title screen at the end of a level, the title screen is created, and once its transition is complete, so once it runs through its transition, then it adds this function. So on complete of this transition, it adds the UI element, which is this restart button. So the restart button is using the widgets that we explained in the previous chapter, and we're giving it the X and Y location, its height, its ID and label, and then the release. So its height is 60 pixels, so that's the current size of it. Its ID is just for our own reference, and the label is the text that's actually on the button. So this says restart, so it says restart here. Then on release is set to only activate when you actually release your touch on the button itself. So it doesn't activate when it's pressed down, it doesn't activate when you move your mouse around on it or your finger. It only activates when it's actually released on top of the button. So if I release my click over here, it doesn't do anything, only when it's on top. Once it is released, it calls this function. And this function removes the screen, the title screen, which is this right here. And this removes all of the objects in this title screen. And then it runs the new game function, which starts a new game of the round. So let's go ahead and click through start and see what happens. So I release on it, and first thing it does is removes the title screen, and then it starts a new game. So you see here we have the new game functioning. And now we're looking at the left and right buttons. As I click them, you see that I move the direction that I tap. Right now I'm just tapping them, but they can also be held down, and that increases the speed over time. You'll notice it doesn't instantly change to the speed you press. It actually takes a while because it's using velocity. So let's go ahead and take a look at the left and right keys and see how they function. They are in the foreground.lua file. So the left button and the right button are given their left and top locations. So the top left corner is left and top here. And they're given their height, so that is why they're 140 pixels. That's why they're much larger than this restart button. Then they have the ID for our reference, and then the label, left and right. So you could change the text on these to anything you'd want, if you don't want it to say left and right. And then it has on event, left button pressed, and on event, right button pressed, which are these functions directly below. So we could potentially do both of these functions together. We could have one button pressed function that handles either of these, but for the sake of readability in this tutorial, we have each one separate. So these are on events, these aren't on releases, so this activates whenever the button has any trigger. So I'm going to go ahead and add some print statements so you can see what happens here. So we're going to print left button, then event.phase. So this is going to show us the phase as it's being pressed. So we'll see here in the print over here that you have began, moved, and then when it's released, ended. Now if you release off of it, it's actually canceled. So there's 2 forms of the ending potential scenario, ending on top of it and ending off of it, which is canceled, and then moved as well. So we don't really care if you move the mouse, we only care if you begin and release. So when you're on top and when you let go, those are the only things we're looking for these buttons. So we have 2 if checks. We have the if the event began, then it sets the focus to this button, which means while the left button is being held, you can't press any other button. This forces it in a single touch mode to only allow events of this type to activate on the button that's being held. So when the phase begins, we lock it to this button. So while left is down, you can't press right, you can't press right restart. We also are setting this boolean left is held to true. So this is telling us that the left button is being held down. and we use that later on in our update function. Then the next stage is that we check if the event is ended or canceled. Now, notice this is an else if because it can't be began and ended. Every time this function's called, it's going to be one of these. So it's either began or it's one of these, or it's moved, but we don't need moved, so we're not worrying about it. So if the event is ended or canceled when you release, we set the left is held to false, so we're telling that boolean that it's no longer being held down, and then we're setting the focus of the screen back to nil, back to nothing. So it's no longer focusing on this button. Once it's ended or canceled, other buttons can be pressed. So that's the basics of the functionality for this button press. Now, this is in fact the same as the right button pressed. We could in fact have these both go to one function. So to give you the only difference here would be this boolean. So this is left is held, this is right is held. So the only difference there is that. Now we could use this ID to determine if it's the ID left or ID right to set these. So these could actually be one function. So we're going to go ahead and test that. So we're just going to use button pressed as our event name. And then we're going to set the on events to button pressed instead of left button pressed and right button pressed. And first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and make it print our button. We're going to print the phase, so button dot and then event dot phase. So now as we press down, we see that it says button began and ended, moved, canceled. So next thing we need is the if event dot phase equals began, same as the ones below. Then we're going to set the else if event dot phase is ended, or if it's canceled. I'm just going to copy paste that. So these are the two if statements that we need for this to function. So let's go ahead and set the target to event.target when it begins and to nil when it's done. So now it locks this button when it's pressed, so other buttons can't be pressed. You'll see here if I comment these out, if I actually hold down on this and move over to this one, it actually triggers this being moved as well because it detects it coming on top of that button. So it actually recognizes two different buttons, and we don't want that to occur. So now what we need to do is check to see what which button is being pressed. So let's go ahead and look at the event.target.id. So we're going to have it print that when it's being pressed. You'll see now it printed left because we gave the ID as left to the event.target ID. So what we're going to do in here is if event.target.id is left, then else if target ID is right, then, and what we're going to do with this is we are going to set this to left is held to true if the left button is held, and right is held to true if the right button is being held. So this now sets that button being held down when it's pressed. Now of course it's going to be stuck in an infinite loop now because we don't have it telling it to be false and ended. So let's go ahead and do that as well. So this is more or less going to be the same bit of code, except we're going to set these to false now. So now we see that we have the same functionality we had before, but using one function instead of two functions. Now this is a bit of a longer function, but now if we want anything that happens to the left button to also happen to the right button to reflect, we don't have to write it twice in two sets of code. It can all work in this button pressed function. So that's the basics of the left and right button. Let's take a look at how this left is held and right is held actually work, how they affect the game, to get a better understanding of what the buttons actually do for the game. So go ahead and take a look at your update function in the main file. You'll see we have two items here. If left is held, player change velocity, If right is held, player change velocity. So what we're checking is if the button is held down, if it's marked the true, then the player object should run the function change velocity. Now for now we just have a -1 and 1. These are our speeds. We could easily change these. This is how fast it goes to the left and how fast it goes to the right. So this function, what the change velocity does, is it actually makes the current velocity of the player object be whatever it currently is, plus the amount that it's changing, so -1 or 1, but it's using this other function, clamp, that prevents it from going out of these boundaries, so negative max speed to positive max speed. So going left is a negative direction because going left is negative on the x-axis. Going right is positive. And if we set our maximum speed, which is set up here, we are clamping this value between negative max speed and positive max speed. So it'll never be any less than -25 or any more than 25. So it holds it within those values. So that's what these change velocity functions do. And then we actually have the update location of the player, and this is run every frame. And what it does is it actually adds velocity to the current x value. So if the velocity is +1, then it adds 1 to the x every frame. Now we also have this additional check that checks to see if the x value is greater than the content width, which is the screen size. If this value is greater than that, then it sets it to 0, which moves it over to the left side of the screen. And the same goes for if it's less than 0, then it makes it the width of the screen. So this is how we get our basic looping functionality. So the moment it hits one edge, it pops over to the other, because we're checking if the value of x is higher or lower than our bounds. So that's the basics of the controls and movement system for the player. Next we're going to take a look at some of the timers and transitions used in this tutorial.